All right, class, it is time to talk literary criticism. You'll see that the image for this project has a bunch of glasses in the picture. You can call these lenses, and that's really the metaphor that I want you to use to help you get through this project. The idea is that in Russell's text, hold that thought, there are a handful of different lenses that you can apply to any work of children's literature. So he lists historical criticism on page 102, structuralism and formalism on page 103, archetypal on page 104, psychoanalytical on page 105. That one's deep and fun. Feminist criticism on page 108. And eco-criticism on page 109. So what you'll do is you will choose, okay, what pair of glasses, I know this is so cheesy, but what pair of glasses do I want to put on, hold that thought, in order to see Charlotte's Web differently. All right, I'm done with my props, I think. The idea here, and I mentioned this in a video last week, is that when you wear lenses to view a text, it's a little bit of a forced activity, right? So I am going to give an example, and I think this example will also lay out sort of the flow of how the project below is going to develop, which is chronological or narrative first-person style. So I taught a 3-class, 15-credit course with 2 other instructors years ago called War. And my contribution to the class was rhetorical criticism, and so we used lenses as well. And I'm going to, in the example I'm about ready to share, we used the feminist lens. And we applied the feminist lens to a short story by the author Tim O'Brien, who is a Vietnam veteran who writes fictional short stories in this collection about his experience as a Vietnam veteran and soldier, all of it, again, fictional. But the specific story was called On the Rainy River, and in this story, the character, Tim O'Brien, in the book, is wrestling with whether or not to accept his draft ticket and go to the war or flee to Canada. And so it's a story of him traveling up north and running into this older man and kind of staying with the older man, and they don't really talk about the dilemma, but Tim O'Brien is wrestling with it inside. So I presented to the class that we were going to put on these feminist glasses and look at the text. Now here's the fun part. Many in the class kind of freaked out about that. Firstly, because the concept of, like, the term feminism implies more than it should. And so you really, first piece of advice, identify what the definition of the lens actually is. So what we did in class with that is we talked about, well, what are some traits that you would consider feminine, and what are some traits that you would consider masculine? And we wrote down all of our ideas on Post-it notes, and then we looked at them and we said, we acknowledged that we're all okay with and celebrate women who have more masculine qualities or men who have more feminine qualities, and that just because we can identify what is stereotypically male or female, most people, regardless of their conservative or liberal spectrum, are okay with some crossing over and recognize that that is natural and even desired in a lot of cases. So we discussed that first we have to figure out, like, what is this thing actually? So if feminism is actually, if the feminist lens actually just requires us to acknowledge just the role of gender and how gender stereotypes, for instance, play into a text, or hold this thought. I'm going to transition that rambling into just what the actual questions are from Russell's text. How are men and women portrayed in the text? What roles do they play? And are the roles gender biased? So that's a neutral question that anyone would be willing to ask. But here's the cool thing. in the classroom, a lot of people were like, there are no females in this story, so how can you use a feminist lens? That's the whole point. If we didn't put on those glasses, props are back, would we have seen or noticed or acknowledged or been drawn to that discussion? So if we just read the text for what it is and we just look at the characters, the plot, the theme, the whatever, we're just going to probably focus on the role of the draft, Tim O'Brien's bravery or courage, his writing style, characterization. But if we put on that forced lens, we're like, oh, there are no females in the story. What does that lead us to discuss? Maybe we start talking about, wow, women feel so much differently when they read this story. I know for me, I was just talking with a friend, when I read a story like that, now I think, what if Hilo, my son, were drafted into the Vietnam War? What would I do as a mother? What would I support? What would I expect of him? And gosh, I hope I would have been this way or that way about it. Or, oh, he is a male in a country where someday he'll have to sign up for the draft. So it is forced. And it doesn't always work out this serendipitously as the example that how I think this example I'm describing worked out. But in that case, it was like, wow, I'm really glad that we looked at this story through that forced feminist lens, because now we're having richer conversations about how women and men read this story differently, how they examine the themes of the story differently because of how they're positioned in society differently, and how they internalize it differently. And then you get into debates, perhaps like the students started to get into debates about, well, why do men carry the burden of being drafted? Is that fair? And the draft still existing but not really being utilized. There's all kinds of spin-offs, right? That's not what you're going to be doing because you're working with Charlotte's Web. But I said this in the previous video that with lenses, I want you to be playful, to be open-minded, to be willing to dig deeply, just to see what you'll find. And then when you're done, you can say, that was stupid. I hope you'll use a more sophisticated phrase to evaluate your experience, but that was ridiculous because blah, 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 or it falls flat. Or, that was really forced, but I discovered this, and here's the benefit of that pursuit that I went on, that journey that I took. One more example, just to illuminate, just to inspire you to do the exercise of literary criticism. One of my favorite short essays that I read in an Introduction to Literature course was written by Stanley Fish, and he is a college professor, and he teaches some kind of advanced poetry course. And so students funnel into the lecture hall and they sit down in this seminar room and look at the board, and Stanley Fish tells his advanced poetry students, I'd like you to analyze the poem on the board. And they do this for 2 hours, and they get really deep, and he shares all of their findings in his short essay and talks about all of the incredible religious and all kinds of undertones that they discovered in the poem. And after 2 hours, at the very end of class, he says, it's not a poem. It's a list of random things that I just left, like the class prior had done a brainstorm, and he went and just kind of randomly erased until he had this thing that had the physical structure of a poem but was nothing. And the students had mixed feelings. Some of them felt betrayed, offended, confused. They wondered, well, then what did I just do? And I think it's really interesting because then you have to ask the question, do the findings actually have to be relevant to the source if what you discover through the act of plucking out the findings, if the findings themselves are valuable to the audience? You guys get to ponder that. That's something that you'll be simultaneously pondering as you do this work. But I like to keep Stanley Fish's essay in mind anytime I dig deeply and maybe I struggle with feeling silly or feeling like I'm being too overly analytical or digging too much. I just tell myself, you know what? You're playing dress up. You're just wearing glasses. It's no big deal. You're just role playing. You're acting. Or, if at the end of the day I dig and I'm going to get real proppish and I discover the world, well then who's the lucky one? who's the silly one then? Just like I said, have fun with it. See what you find, and we can reflect on the activity afterwards.